Good day, dear doctors. Good day, everyone. Welcome to this module. This is Neuroanatomy 101. We will be talking about the motor pathways, particularly the pyramidal tracts. So our goal in this short session is to simplify one of the Waterloos of neuroanatomy for both medical students, clinicians, and doctors. So these are our learning objectives. So first is to identify, to describe, and to understand. So our goal is to identify the two main components of the pyramidal tract, to describe the course and the decussation of the pyramidal tracts, and lastly, to understand the function of the pyramidal tracts. Now, I want everyone to be reminded of the cortical homunculus. So the word homunculus means a little man or a little human. As you can see, the cortical homunculus is a distorted representation of the human body based on a neurological map of the areas and proportions of the brain dedicated to processing the motor functions as well as the sensory functions for the different parts of the body. And as you can see, it is disproportionate or it is exaggerated based on how much, of that area of the brain that part of the body represents. So you can see here that the lips, the tongue, the eyes, the face, the hands, are quite large compared to the usual proportion of the human body. Now, your knowledge about the homunculus would help you understand, your knowledge about the homunculus would help you understand better lesions, to a specific part of the brain and how it will manifest in a patient clinically. So please take note of that. Now, let's talk about the pyramidal tract. When we say the pyramidal tract, this is one of the tracts or pathways of the body which provides voluntary control. It provides voluntary control of muscular movements. Now, the pyramidal tract has two distinct pathways. Please remember this. What are the two pathways? What are the two pathways of the pyramidal tract? We have the corticobulbar tract and we have the corticospinal tract. So as the name indicates, the corticospinal tract is a pathway which has fibers originating from the cortex going to the spinal cord, while the corticobulbar tract is a pathway that has fibers that originates from the cortex, hence the term cortico, then to the bulbar area or the brainstem, particularly the cranial nerve nuclei of the brainstem. So again, what are you supposed to remember? What are the two distinct pathways of the pyramidal tract? Number one, corticospinal tract. Number two, corticobulbar tract. Now, there is also the extrapyramidal system. These are the pathways, or the motor sensory tracts, which are outside of the pyramidal tract. Therefore, it is outside of the corticospinal tract. It is outside of the corticobulbar tract. And these are the following. We have the rubrospinal tract. When we say rubro, we're referring to the red nucleus of the midbrain. Then we have the vestibulospinal tract, reticulospinal tract. Then we have the tectospinal tract, also known as the Corticospinal Tract. Now, please remember this. What are the tracts which are found in the extrapyramidal system? Number one, rubrospinal. Number two, the vestibulospinal. Number three, we have the reticulospinal. And lastly, we have the tectospinal, also known as the Corticospinal Tract. Okay, now we have the pyramidal tract, and here we have the extrapyramidal tract. Now, always remember both the corticospinal and the corticobulbar are responsible for voluntary control. The main difference is the corticospinal tract is responsible for voluntary control of the body, while the corticobulbar tract is for the head, the face, and the neck. Please remember this. What pyramidal tract is responsible for voluntary control of the face, head, and neck? It is the corticobulbar tract. Okay, now the corticospinal tract divides. So the corticospinal tract divides into the lateral corticospinal tract and the anterior corticospinal tract. So please take note of that. The extrapyramidal tract is divided into rubrospinal, reticulospinal, vestibulospinal, and the tectospinal or the corticospinal tract. The rubrospinal tract is responsible for fine motor control. Now, I hope everyone knows the Rubik's Cube, okay? So just think of the Rubik's Cube because it sounds like Rubik's sounds like rubro. You need fine motor control. Okay, again, you need fine motor control to crack the Rubik's Cube. Now, the reticulospinal tract divides into the medial reticulospinal tract and the lateral reticulospinal tract. What I want you to remember is that the medial reticulospinal tract is responsible for contraction of the muscle. It would increase the muscle tone. While, on the other hand, the lateral reticulospinal tract is responsible for relaxation of the muscle. It would now decrease muscle tone. Vestibulospinal, from the word vestibular, is responsible for balance as well as posture. And responsible for coordination of the head is the tectospinal or the corticospinal tract. So please take note of this. Now, the relevant tracts for both motor and somatosensory function, I want you to remember there is one motor tract and there are two sensory tracts. The motor tract, this is the corticospinal. This is what we're going to emphasize on. The sensory tract, there are two. So there's the anterolateral and there's the dorsal pathway. So again, motor is the corticospinal. Sensory, there's two pathways or two tracts. This is the anterolateral. Then we have the dorsal column pathways. Now, please remember, so again, remember this. The anterolateral tract is also known as the spinothalamic tract. Now, what sensory modality does the spinothalamic tract convey? it conveys pain and temperature. Okay, so I want everyone to remember this. If you were to take a quiz or take an exam, this would most likely come out. Spinothalamic tract is pain and temperature, while the dorsal or the posterior columns, this is responsible for conveying vibration and position. So remember all of these. And what do we call position sense? Okay, what is the medical term for position sense? Okay, let's see your answers. It is proprioception. So I want everyone to remember that. Okay, it is proprioception. Please remember these by heart. The two sensory tracts. We have the anterolateral, also known as the spinothalamic tract. Then we have the dorsal or the posterior columns. What sensory modalities are conveyed again by the spinothalamic? It's pain and temperature. And what is conveyed by the dorsal or the posterior columns? It is vibration and proprioception. Now, I want everyone to remember this concept because we are now going to dig deeper into the actual pathways. And this is where the Waterloo of most medical students comes in. So the corticospinal, so cortico means, okay, motor information comes from the cortex of the brain. Then the spinal, of course, stands for the spinal cord. So the corticospinal tract will send motor information from the cortex of the brain to the spinal cord. Now, does anyone here know what specific part of the cortex of the brain is involved? Okay, so think, what part of the cortex of the brain is involved in the corticospinal tract? Where does the corticospinal tract originate? Okay, so from what part of the cortex? So we have the primary cortex, okay, the primary motor, and it also receives some help from the premotor. So we have primary motor, we have the premotor, and we also have the supplementary motor cortex. Okay, primary motor, premotor, and the supplementary motor. Okay, now let's begin with the actual corticospinal tract. So as you can see here, we have the motor cortex, we have the primary motor cortex, we have the premotor cortex, and we have the supplementary motor cortex. It's all in this area of the brain. So the corticospinal tract is a collection of axons. Remember, axons carry impulses away from the cell body. So A for away, A for axon. A collection of axons that carries movement-related information because it's all about motor function. From the cerebral cortex down to the spinal cord until it reaches the skeletal muscle for the actual execution of the movement. So the corticospinal tract mainly arises from the primary motor cortex. Please remember this. So if you were to take an exam, this is what everyone has to remember. Where does the corticospinal tract mainly arise from? It arises from the primary motor cortex of the brain. Okay, and it receives additional contributions from the following areas of the brain. We have the premotor cortex, as well as the supplementary motor cortex, and of course, the somatosensory cortex. So for movement to occur, for motor function to occur, these areas of the brain will supplement each other. So one more time, majority arises from the primary motor cortex. Then it's supplemented by the premotor, the supplementary motor, and the somatosensory cortex. Now, the corticospinal tract will carry motor signals from the primary motor cortex to the spinal cord, down to the muscles of the trunk and the limbs. So I want you to repeat to yourself right now what is highlighted in red. Primary motor cortex, spinal cord, then we have the muscles of the trunk and the limbs. And as mentioned earlier, corticospinal tract is involved with voluntary movement of muscles. Now, here, what do we call this distorted representation again? What is this that I just encircled? Okay, remember this. What do we call this again? This distorted graphic representation of the different body parts and regions as it is represented in the brain. We call this the cortical or motor homunculus. Okay, so here, this area is the primary motor cortex. And these are the areas everyone has to memorize. Corticospinal, primary motor, premotor, and the supplementary motor, as well as the somatosensory, as mentioned earlier. Okay, so let's dissect this pathway. The premotor cortex, this is BA6, that stands for Brodmann Area 6. So please know this by heart. Remember this. Again, please remember that the premotor cortex is also known as Brodmann's Area 6 or BA6. And always remember the primary motor cortex is Brodmann Area 4. Okay, now I want you guys to remember this by heart. Now, question, what do we call the giant pyramidal cells that are present in the primary motor cortex and is not present in the premotor cortex? What do we call the giant pyramidal cells that are present in the primary motor cortex that are not present in the premotor cortex? Okay, very good. We call them the BET cells. Why are these important? Because the axons, the collection of axons from the primary motor cortex, okay, these are the giant pyramidal cells. These are known as the BET cells. Remember this, okay? Now let's dissect the actual pathway. So we have the motor homunculus here, and this is the primary motor cortex. So always remember the corticospinal tract originates from the upper motor neurons in the primary motor cortex. So this is where it originates from. This is the first order neurons here. So these arising fibers, do you see this? Okay. These arising fibers forms the corona radiata. So it radiates. Look at these fibers. Hence the term corona radiata. So the arising fibers form the corona radiata. Now here, this is the corona radiata. These fibers will now converge. Look, the fibers of the corona radiata will now converge, and it passes through this structure here, known as the posterior limb of the internal capsule, before it proceeds to the brainstem. If you remember, the brainstem is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So memorize this. The arising fibers will form the corona radiata, and these fibers of the corona radiata will converge at the posterior limb of the internal capsule as it heads to the brainstem, particularly the midbrain. So the fibers will pass through the cerebral peduncle. So this is the cerebral peduncle here. This is the posterior limb. Okay, posterior limb. Heads to the brainstem. Passes through the cerebral peduncle. So here, passes through the cerebral peduncle. Then the pons. Okay, look at this. Until it reaches the pyramids of the medulla. Okay, so please take note of this. And this is why it's called the pyramidal track, because the fibers will actually reach the pyramids of the medulla. So again, we have the bed cells from the primary motor cortex. These fibers will form the corona radiata, and the corona radiata fibers will merge to become the corticospinal tract. It goes through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, heads to the brainstem, goes through the cerebral peduncle, the pons, and the medullary pyramids, or the pyramids of the medulla. Now, at the inferior level of the medulla, so take note, this is now the inferior medulla oblongata. 90%. Now look at these blue fibers, which I just made red. Look at this. 90% of the fibers from the pyramids will now cross over. Look, it's crossing over to the other side, and this is what we call the decussation of the pyramids, or the pyramidal decussation. Now, take note of what is highlighted in yellow. You have to remember inferior medulla. At the level of the inferior medulla, this is where the fibers will decussate or cross to the opposite side. And this action of crossing to the other side is called decussation. So, question, where, at what level is the pyramidal decussation? At what level? Let's see if you understand. At what level is the pyramidal decussation? Is it the inferior or the superior medulla oblongata? Okay, so the decussation is at the inferior medulla oblongata. Now, look at these fibers. 90% will decussate to the opposite side, and it continues as the corticospinal tract until it reaches the spinal cord. However, look at this here. The remaining 10% that do not cross or do not decussate, it stays on the same side, and this is now known as the anterior corticospinal tract. So, question, which decussates? The lateral, okay, or the anterior corticospinal tract? Which will decussate? I want everyone to remember the one that crosses is the lateral corticospinal tract. Lateral is the one that goes to the opposite side. In the Visayan dialect, labang. It's the one that crossed. Letter L. Ang nilabang is si lateral. Anterior corticospinal tract, which is about 10% of the fibers, stays on the same side. Now, at this point, the upper motor neurons, which we refer to as UMN, of both the anterior corticospinal tract and the lateral corticospinal tract will now synapse with the lower motor neurons in the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord. Now, question, what is the landmark or the boundary between upper and lower motor neuron? It is the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord. Remember this, okay? The boundary or the landmark between the upper and the lower motor neuron is the anterior horn cells, okay? Now, the lower motor neurons will now leave the spinal cord. So here's the spinal cord through the anterior roots to form the peripheral nerves. And it is the peripheral nerves that will innervate the muscles of the trunk and the muscles of the limbs. So the anterior corticospinal tract, is the anterior corticospinal tract the one that stays on the same side, or is it the one that crosses to the opposite side? What is the anterior corticospinal tract? The one that stays on the same side or the one that crosses? It is the one that stays on the same side. This is the 10% of the fibers of the corticospinal tract. This is also known as the bundle of Turk. Remember this. The bundle of Turk emerges from the undecussated fibers of the corticospinal tract. Look at this here. Undecussated fibers. The decussation occurs here. This is the one that becomes the lateral. The undecussated fibers, this is the anterior corticospinal tract. This occurs at the bulbomedullary junction. This occurs in the bulbomedullary junction. So what is the function of the anterior corticospinal tract? The anterior corticospinal tract is primarily responsible for the gross as well as postural movement of the trunk as well as the limb muscles. So gross movement as well as postural movement. Okay, the lateral corticospinal tract, this is the largest. So letter L for lateral, it's letter L, it's the one that labangs or crosses. Letter L for the largest. it is the largest descending motor pathway. When we say descending, it's coming from the brain to the spinal cord. When we say ascending pathway, it's from the spinal cord sending signals to the brain. Always remember descending pathways. This is the motor pathways. The ascending pathway, that means from the spinal cord to the brain, this is the sensory. So basically the lateral corticospinal tract, look at this, the lateral, this is shaded in blue, the lateral corticospinal tract will span the entire length of the spinal cord. And it's there to supply basically motor signals to the muscles of the skeletal muscles, in particular of the trunk and the lower limbs. But it's predominantly going to be the lower limbs. So letter L for lateral, letter L, nilabang, it crosses, letter L for largest, and letter L for the limbs. Okay, letter L for the limbs. Okay, so main function of the lateral corticospinal tract, voluntary movement of the contralateral upper and lower limbs. Okay, voluntary movement of the contralateral upper and lower limbs. Memorize this. So please remember this. Okay.